This hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. We are here today to consider nominees for three important positions: ambassadors to China, Japan, and Singapore. On the first panel, we'll hear from Ambassador Nick Burns to be an ambassador to China. I understand Senator Markey will introduce Ambassador Burns, so I'll turn to him at this time. Senator Markey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Risch. It's my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce our nominee today, Nicholas Burns, nominated to be the Ambassador of the United States to the People's Republic of China. Ambassador Burns is a cherished son of Massachusetts, a fellow Boston College alumnus, and a proud member of Red Sox Nation. I'd also like to welcome Ambassador Burns' wife, Libby, who has joined us today. Name a diplomatic flashpoint of the last 4 decades, and there is a good chance that Ambassador Burns was either a witness or an active participant. In his exemplary career as a member of the Foreign Service, he served 4 U.S. presidents. Among his assignments, he spent 5 years at the National Security Council, first as Director of Soviet Affairs under President George H.W. Bush, and later as Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia Affairs under President Clinton. In those roles, President Burns helped shepherd the United States through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the establishment of new relationships with the former Soviet bloc countries. In 1997, he was named U.S. Ambassador to Greece, where he helped to expand our bilateral defense relationship and counterterrorism. In 2001, President George Bush selected him to serve as U.S. Ambassador to NATO. He took this post 1 month before the attacks of 9/11, just 1 month before 9/11, when the alliance invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history. He later served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the highest-ranking Foreign Service officer in Foggy Bottom. Ambassador Burns has established a deep understanding of the United States' relationship with China and has been a returning visitor to China for more than 3 decades. As a junior officer, he first accompanied Secretary George Shultz in 1988 and President Bush in 1989. He later accompanied Secretary Madeleine Albright to Hong Kong in June of 1997 for its handover from the United Kingdom to the People's Republic of China. After his retirement from the Foreign Service, Ambassador Burns turned his attention to training the next generation of diplomats and security professionals at the Harvard Kennedy School. In short, there is no more qualified person than Ambassador Burns to serve in Beijing as our top diplomat. I am confident that Ambassador Burns will seek to engage Beijing where we must on the existential issues of the climate crisis and nuclear nonproliferation, on curbing the flow of synthetic opioids to our shores, and bringing North Korea to the negotiating table. But I'm equally confident that he will speak out forcefully against the Chinese government's abuses in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and elsewhere. In Ambassador Burns, the men and women of the Foreign Service will have no greater champion. He has the experience, the knowledge, and the leadership skills for this critical post in a difficult but crucial time in our relationship with the People's Republic of China. In a commencement speech at our alma mater, Boston College, in 2002, Ambassador Burns concluded in summing up the school's ethos. It is the core belief that how we lead our lives should not be just about and for ourselves, but about what we all can do. In the poet Tennyson's words, to seek a newer world here on earth. We are honored that you have again decided to take this opportunity, Ambassador Burns, to once again seek that newer world here on earth. I yield back, Mr. Chairman, and I urge the support of every committee member for this great ambassador.
Thank you, Senator Markey, for a glowing introduction. We appreciate it. You're, of course, an important member of our committee, so we look forward to you joining us on the regular dais when you're finished. Ambassador Burns says, welcome to you and your wife. You're an outstanding public servant. As a career Foreign Service officer, we're grateful to you and your family for your willingness to serve our country again. As you know, if confirmed, you'll have a monumental task before you. As I've said before, the China of 2021 is not the China of 1971 or even the China of 2011. China today is challenging the United States and destabilizing the international community across every dimension of power: political, diplomatic, economic, military, and even cultural, with an alternative and deeply disturbing model for global governance. I truly believe that China today, led by the Communist Party and propelled by Xi Jinping's hypernationalism, is unlike any challenge we have faced as a nation before. For decades, we failed to comprehensively address China's growing reach, from its predatory economic behavior and aggressive efforts to coerce its neighbors in the maritime domain, its dangerous flexing of military muscle against Taiwan, to the crushing of the religious and cultural autonomy of Tibet, and its campaign of genocide against the Uyghur people, as well as the imposition of a chilling system of digital authoritarianism to suppress and oppress its own people. China today is more active and more emboldened than ever before. There should be little doubt that the right basic framework for thinking about our relationship with China today is strategic competition, not because that is necessarily what we want, but because of the choices Beijing is making. Therefore, if confirmed, you'll need to be clear-eyed about Beijing's intentions and actions and play a key role in calibrating this administration's still emergent policy and strategy regarding China. This committee has engaged extensively on China over the last several months, including passing the Strategic Competition Act with overwhelming bipartisan support. Enacting the bill is one critical step in ensuring a solid framework for White House and State Department efforts to address the challenge posed by China. I know you bring to this job a wealth of diplomatic experience and skill, so we're very interested in hearing from you today about how you think of the challenge and the challenge that the international community faces from China, and how you think we need to frame our strategy for success in this new era of strategic competition. I look forward to hearing your testimony. Let me turn to the ranking member for his opening comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm like most members, or many members of the committee, have known Nick for a long time. We first met in the early part of the last decade in Luxembourg when he was serving as the ambassador to NATO. It's, I think, appropriate that Ambassador Burns was appointed to this position, which really demands a bipartisan approach. And I think Congress, notwithstanding our other emaciations on other issues, has certainly has taken a bipartisan approach to the challenges that China faces, or that China has presented to us and that we will face over the rest of this century, I believe. The position of ambassador to China is one of the most important ambassadorial nominations we will consider in this committee. The People's Republic of China is leveraging its political, diplomatic, economic, military, technological, and ideological power to wage strategic competition against the United States. The Chinese Communist Party policies and actions threaten U.S. interests and values, as well as allies and partners on just about every continent, but particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Well, this challenge will persist for decades. The competition is here now, and we must act urgently. Advancing U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific region must be our number one foreign policy priority. If confirmed, Ambassador Burns, you will be on the front lines of this competition. There are a few priorities that form the foundation of the Bipartisan Strategic Competition Act led by Senator Menendez and myself, which passed through this committee earlier this year. First, China's growing military might is dramatically shifting the regional balance of power in the Indo-Pacific in its favor. We need to counter China's conventional and nuclear buildup that threatens our interests and our allies. Nowhere is China flexing this military might as much as it is in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan's President Tsai is right. Quote, if Taiwan were to fall, the consequences would be catastrophic for regional peace and democratic alliance systems, end quote. It is imperative that we work actively to deter PRC's coercion and aggression towards Taiwan. Another issue that is not discussed as often, but must be, is China's pursuit of life sciences research with potential for weaponization, causing concern about potential violations of the Biological Weapons Convention. I've introduced legislation, the Biological Weapons Policy Act, that would give our country team in China a larger role in ensuring that biological research cooperation with China does not put us or the world at risk. Second, our diplomatic mission in China must be strengthened to address the economic and political facets of the competition at hand. That includes providing information to decision makers in Washington on how the CCP seeks to exert undue political influence in our open society. On the economic front, we must ensure our economic core and mission China is up to the task of dealing with new challenges. China is rolling out laws and regulations to punish companies for complying with U.S. law, including our sanctions laws. The Chinese government is also stamping out all free market activity by asserting control over its financial institutions and its technology companies. Another challenge where we need an active economic core is addressing pressing supply chain vulnerabilities, especially in technology and healthcare. Of course, advancing human rights must continue to be a central priority in our China policy. Ambassador Burns, you face a tough environment. China said it won't work with us on anything until the United States gives in to the demands of its two lists. You and I discussed those lists yesterday, and someday I hope to be able to see those lists. How the Biden administration plans to deal with that is not clear. In our diplomatic engagements, China has repeatedly shown a lack of interest in good faith discussions. Yet the administration continues to assert that China can be a partner on a variety of issues, notably climate. On Taiwan, I applaud recent defense sales, but we have also seen a lot of unclear messaging, including recent allusions to a Taiwan agreement. And despite China's massive and unconstrained nuclear buildup, the administration is considering a sole-purpose nuclear declaratory policy that would put U.S. allies at immense risk and shake confidence in U.S. deterrence commitments. I know that our allies have communicated serious objections to the administration on this topic. So far, the administration is refusing to share those communications with Congress. This issue is even more important given China's test this past weekend of a fractional orbital bombardment system carrying a hypersonic glide vehicle. Such a system would allow the PRC to completely circumvent U.S. early warning capabilities and increase the vulnerability of the continental U.S. to a nuclear attack. I look forward to hearing how you plan to address all of these challenges and to help us win this competition. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Risch. With that, Ambassador, you're recognized. We ask you to summarize your statement in about 5 minutes or so. We will include your full statement for the record. And with that, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Ranking Member Risch, members of the committee, thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you this morning. I'm very grateful to President Biden for this nomination to be the next United States ambassador to the People's Republic of China. I owe profound thanks to my wife of 40 years, Libby, who's with me today, seated just behind me. Together, we've served the U.S. government overseas in Mauritania, West Africa, in Egypt, in Israel, in Greece, and at NATO in Belgium. And both of us are grateful to our 3 daughters, our son-in-law, and our grandchildren. If confirmed by the Senate, I look forward to returning to public service and the State Department, where I've spent the bulk of my professional career. I've worked for administrations of both parties, and I'd be honored to lead our team at the U.S. mission in China. That team is on the front lines of this complicated and consequential relationship that we have with China. I'd like to explain our policy and the policy that I would like to support if confirmed by the Senate. Secretary Tony Blinken said in March that the United States relationship with the PRC is the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. We will compete, and compete vigorously with the People's Republic where we should, including on jobs and the economy, on critical infrastructure, on emerging technologies. As President Biden has said, when the United States competes on a level playing field, there is no country on earth that can match us. We will cooperate with the PRC where it is in our interest, including on climate change, counter-narcotics, global health, and of course on non-proliferation. The world cannot solve the climate crisis without the PRC doing more to reduce their emissions. It's to our benefit to maintain engagement between our peoples as well, including students, scholars, diplomats, and journalists, so long as America's laws are respected. Finally and crucially, We will challenge Beijing where we must, including when it takes actions that run counter to American values and American interests, actions that might threaten the security of the United States or our allies and partners or undermine the rules-based international order. The PRC seeks to become the most powerful country economically, politically, and militarily in the Indo-Pacific. We have to stand with our allies and our friends to uphold a free and open Indo-Pacific, including by maintaining America's commercial and military superiority in 21st century technologies. We also have to hold the PRC accountable for failing to play by the rules on trade and investment, including its theft of intellectual property, use of state subsidies, dumping of goods, and unfair labor practices. These hurt American workers, and they hurt American businesses. Beijing has been an aggressor against India along their long Himalayan border, against Vietnam, the Philippines, and others in the South China Sea, against Japan in the East China Sea, and Beijing has launched an intimidation campaign against Australia and even more recently Lithuania. The PRC's genocide in Xinjiang, its abuses in Tibet, its smothering of Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms, and its bullying of Taiwan are unjust and must stop. Beijing's recent actions against Taiwan are especially objectionable. The United States is right to continue its one China policy, but we're also right to support the peaceful resolution of disputes in this region and to oppose unilateral actions that undermine the status quo and undermine the stability of the region. The administration and Congress, together on a bipartisan basis, should help Taiwan to maintain a self-defense capability, and that's the language of the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. The Biden administration as well is surely right to seek effective channels of communication with Beijing to manage this competition responsibly, to diminish the risk of an accidental conflict, and above all, to maintain the peace. The United States has to proceed from a position of strength and pursue intense diplomacy in all these matters. Beijing proclaims that the East is rising and the West is in decline. I'm confident in our own country. I believe that together with our allies and our partners, we can prove them wrong. This will require very close alignment here in Washington between Congress and the executive branch. The bipartisan Senate passage of the Innovation and Competition Act earlier this year is a very wise investment in America's future and our ability to compete. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I'd say this, my final point. The People's Republic of China is not an Olympian power. It's a country of extraordinary strength, but it also has substantial weaknesses and challenges demographically, economically, politically. We should have confidence in our strengths, American strengths, confidence in our business community, in our innovation community, in our universities, in our ability to attract the best students from around the world, confidence in our unmatched military and our first-rate foreign service and civil service, confidence in our values that stand in brilliant opposition to China's authoritarian regime. We will succeed if we build this American strength around our diplomacy with the People's Republic of China. And on that basis, Mr. Chairman, if confirmed, I'm looking forward to working with you, the ranking member, and Republicans and Democrats on this committee. I've enjoyed my meetings over the last 3 weeks, and I hope together we can form an effective and strong policy towards China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll start a round of 5 minutes. Before I start mine, let me ask some questions we asked for the committee as a whole. These are questions that speak to the importance that this committee places on responsiveness by all officials in the executive branch, and we expect and will be seeking from you. So I'd ask you to provide just a simple yes or no answer to these questions. Do you agree to appear before this committee and make officials from your office available to the committee and designated staff when invited?
Yes.
Do you commit to keep the committee fully and currently informed about the activities that will be under your purview?
Yes.
Do you commit to engaging in meaningful consultation while policies are being developed, not just providing notification after the fact?
Yes.
And do you commit to promptly responding to requests for briefings and information requested by the committee and its designated staff?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, let me start off. First of all, I think your statement encompasses many of the sentiments, concerns, and questions that members of the committee have. And so it was very encompassing of many of the issues I think we care about. And together we have to work to make sure that Xi Jinping is wrong, that the East is not setting, but it will continue to shine. Now, many experts emphasize the importance of U.S. collaboration and joint action with allies, partners, and multilateral organizations to address the challenges that China poses. However, collaboration can be harder in practice than in theory, particularly when countries have different views and competing interests. In what specific areas can you speak to that collaboration has been helpful in addressing the challenges that China poses, and in what areas and with which countries do you see particular opportunities or constraints?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think this is the right question to ask about how we form a strategy that can be successful against the Chinese government. The comparative advantage that we have versus China is that we have treaty allies. We have partners who deeply believe in us, and the Chinese really do not. And so in the Indo-Pacific, I think President Biden has tried to emphasize the need for us to be very closely aligned with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, our treaty allies, our defense partners, the Philippines and Thailand. As you know, and I think every administration since President Clinton has been working on this, we have a newfound security partner in India. That makes a great difference to have Indian American interests aligned, as they clearly are strategically in the Indo-Pacific. And President Biden, of course, has taken the Quad idea, and I give credit to President Trump and Secretary Pompeo for reinvigorating the Quad in 2019 and 20, but President Biden has held 2 head of government meetings of the Quad, one virtual and one in person, at the White House. President Biden's initiative for AUKUS to deepen our strategic engagement with our great ally, Australia, and our ally, the United Kingdom, could be transformational, and I think has been widely praised to be such in the Indo-Pacific. So as we confront China, whether it's on the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's the fight that we have to convince China, push China to play by the rules on trade, we have a coincidence of views with Japan, the European Union, the European allies on all these issues. And I think the President has focused on the Indo-Pacific, but he's also focusing on the European allies. And I have seen a change in the last 2 or 3 years in the attitudes of most European governments, now much more skeptical about China on 5G, on China's nefarious Belt and Road Initiative influence in Eastern Europe. And so I do think this is a big part of the strategy that we need to continue to work on.
Now, let me turn to Taiwan. Given increasing aggression and threatening rhetoric from Beijing, some have called for an end to the policy of strategic ambiguity with regard to Taiwan. How do you think the United States can most effectively signal our resolve and deter Chinese aggression towards Taiwan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a central question these days, particularly after all the bullying and intimidation tactics of the Chinese towards Taiwan, the sending of 150 Chinese aircrafts into the air identification zone of Taiwan just 10 days ago. My own view, and fortunately this is backed up, I think, by both the Biden administrations and every other administration going back 4 decades, is that we have enormous latitude, Congress and the executive branch, under the Taiwan Relations Act, to deepen our security assistance to Taiwan. The Taiwan Relations Act, written in January 1979, is remarkably modern for the strategic questions we're facing in 2021. It says that we have an unofficial relationship with Taiwan, obviously, but we have a responsibility to help Taiwan achieve a self-defense capability through the provision of defense articles and services. So since 2009, the Obama and the Trump and the Biden administrations have provided about $30 billion worth of assistance to Taiwan. Given what China's done, given China's frankly objectionable statements towards Taiwan, I think the Congress and the executive branch have every right to continue to deepen our security cooperation, to expand our arms provisions to Taiwan. That's the most important thing we can do. In addition to that, the Taiwan Relations Act also calls for the United States to provide the strongest possible deterrent in the Western Pacific, the language of 1979, or the Indian Ocean as we would refer to it today. And in addition to that, as a third measure, we ought to be asking, and we are asking our allies, to show a real commitment to Taiwan. And we're seeing that from Japan and other allies. Finally, Mr. Chairman, we've got to be very clear about our criticism of China. And what the Chinese are trying to do to this very successful society on Taiwan, with this very healthy democracy, extraordinary performance in the coronavirus, is to simply intimidate them. And so we've all got to speak up and shine a light on those Chinese actions and Chinese rhetoric. That's essentially the policy of the last 40 years. I think that policy is the right one and the smart one for today.
Thank you. Senator Risch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's pick up with Taiwan where you left off. How do you differentiate what happened in Hong Kong with Taiwan? In reading and listening to the Chinese, it seems to me that Taiwan's even more of an irritant to them than Hong Kong was. Fortunately, Taiwan's got the sea between themselves and China. But I really fear that we're going to see the same kind of pushing the envelope in Taiwan that gets it to a point where there's a crisis. What are your views on that?
Senator, you're right to ask that question. I share your concern. As Senator Markey mentioned, I was State Department spokesperson. I accompanied Secretary Albright on June 30th, 1997, to the handover from the UK to the PRC on Hong Kong. And all of us remember, but I particularly remember from our meeting with the Chinese leadership that day, the commitments they made to the people of Hong Kong and to the rest of us around the world, and the Chinese have gone back on every one of those commitments. So if we link that to Taiwan, we obviously cannot trust China to meet the commitments it's made on the Taiwan issue. When Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, when administration after administration pursued a one-China policy, we obviously did so on the presumption that there would be peace in the cross-strait relationship between Taiwan and China. And there isn't much peace today. There's assertiveness and aggression. So I don't think we certainly cannot trust the Chinese in this issue. We have to be aware of their rhetoric, aware of it, and the rhetoric of its leader and many other Chinese leaders in recent months has been that they intend to take back Taiwan. Our responsibility is to make Taiwan a tough nut to crack, help it increase its asymmetric defenses through the Taiwan Relations Act, and other countries can do that as well. It's a central issue in the relationship now.
And I agree with that. The thing that I guess I'm concerned about as much as anything is watching what they've been doing with their incursions into the airspace reminds me a lot of Hong Kong. It's just pushing the envelope. It's a camel's nose in the tent, and it just gets worse and worse until it collapses. So that's going to be something I think we're going to have to watch very closely. Let's talk about China's nuclear buildup. Do you agree that they're pursuing a massive nuclear buildup in China?
It certainly appears so, both in the western part of China, where the reports of the ICBM expansion, and also with this novel delivery system that has been publicized of late.
One thing that is very concerning to me, and I think other members of this committee, is that there's this discussion within the administration of a sole purpose nuclear declaratory policy, which is in essence a no first use. It's another way of saying no first use, but it's not as direct, but it's the exact same thing. I would hope you'd become a spokesman within the administration about how damaging that kind of a declaration would be a sole purpose declaration. I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not, but I can guarantee you that the allies, particularly the ones that are counting on us in the Indo-Pacific region, are very concerned about the declaration of sole purpose nuclear declaratory policy. What are your thoughts on that?
Senator, I appreciated our conversation last evening about this in your office. And as I explained, I'm a private citizen appearing before you as a nominee without access to the intelligence. I don't have a security clearance, so I'm very reluctant to speak specifically about the nuclear posture review, which is underway. But I do know that President Biden has indicated clearly that he is going to support the strongest possible and the safest American nuclear deterrent, as every president has done since President Harry Truman. And that's obviously an obligation to the American people. I would also just add, Senator Risch, we also talked about this last week. I think the spotlight should be on China. They have said for decades, the Chinese government, that they want to have a minimum nuclear deterrent. They are blasting past that definition, and they're rapidly engaged in the buildup of their nuclear arsenal, including the disturbing reports of the hypersonic technology. So I think the spotlight has to be on the government of China.
Well, I agree with that. You having the credentials that you have on a bipartisan basis and your deep knowledge of our allies, and particularly ones that we have a defensive posture with, I would hope you would be a spokesman within the administration regarding this. I'm very concerned about it. A lot of people are concerned about it. And I understand that you've done an excellent job throughout your career of carrying water on both shoulders for administration from either party. I think that brings a tremendous amount of credibility to you, and I think your words in that regard would be very important as they proceed with the nuclear posture review. I have no doubt they will be consulting with you, given the position you're in. So I would urge that you communicate in the strongest terms to the administration the concern that our allies in the region have for this policy. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Burns, first of all, let me thank you for your incredible career of public service. You have really advanced American values globally in every post that you've held, and I personally have appreciated your advice during very difficult times. So thank you very much for your service to our country and your willingness to continue in this critical role as our ambassador in China. There are so many issues that we need to talk about. And we've already mentioned a lot of our national security concerns. We know that China is belligerent in the China Seas, making claims that are outrageous and affect international commerce and our national security. We know that they are trying to change the rules of engagement economically so that they determine the rules based upon a government-controlled economy rather than an open economy, which is against our national security interests. We know how belligerent they are against Taiwan, and the list goes on and on and on. But I want to devote my time to what President Biden has said, that we are strongest when we conduct our foreign policy based upon our values. And China, in the recent decades, has just been moving in the wrong direction on universal human right values. And we could go through the entire list, and it's a long list. So I guess my question to you, how will you balance and strategize America's presence in China through your mission to advance universal values of the respect for individuals, religious freedom, human rights, and basic beliefs that the universal community that believes in democracy looks to America's leadership as hope for the future?
Senator, thank you very much for that question, and thank you for your decades of service to those issues, and I'm very well aware of that. I think you're right to suggest that as we think about our tools, our strengths, as we compete with China, it's our belief in human freedom and human rights, in democracy, in the rule of law, in press freedoms, that really stands in opposition to an authoritarian dictatorship in Beijing. And so if we can marshal those strengths, and President Biden and his administration believe this is at the center of their foreign policy on Xinjiang, on Tibet, on Hong Kong, on the repression of the Chinese people, we can't just do that sometimes. We cannot be silent if there are atrocities occurring, or in the case of Xinjiang, a genocide is occurring. We have to speak out. And you've seen the President, Secretary Blinken, and all of the officials been very forthright about that since January 20th of this year. I think that will continue, and that will certainly be, if I am confirmed, a hallmark of what I try to do, speaking directly to the Chinese government in Beijing.
I would ask also that you inform this committee as to how we can give you a stronger hand in dealing on these issues. We have passed sanction regime laws that have been used against oppressors in China, individual sanctions such as Magnitsky, as well as sectorial sanctions have been used. And I think they have their effect. I think they're extremely important. But we need to also think beyond that as to what we can do to give you what you need. The competitiveness bill that the chairman mentioned, I think, is going to be an extremely important part of our strategy against in standing up to China's oppression on the economic front. But we should also be looking at what we can do as a Congress to give you a stronger hand in China in dealing with these universal rights. So I would welcome your advice as to what we can do to give you a stronger toolbox in dealing with these issues.
Thank you, Senator. And I would just suggest a couple of things, and I've spoken to the chairman and other members of the committee in my individual meetings about them. First and foremost, when the coronavirus mercifully ends, and when the restrictions on China, there's a 3-week quarantine in China for visitors, at some point end, I hope that members of Congress from both parties will travel to China. And if I'm confirmed, I would like to help you to do that. I think they need to hear directly from our legislative branch on these issues. These will be difficult conversations for you and for me with the Chinese leadership, but we have to have them. Secondly, I would encourage you respectfully to continue what you're doing, what this committee has done under the chairman's leadership and Senator Risch's leadership on a bipartisan basis to speak out and legislate when necessary and to sanction when necessary. Third and finally, President Biden was right on the issue of Xinjiang and the Uyghurs and the other Turkic Muslim peoples when he coalesced with Canada, the European Union, and the United Kingdom in multinational sanctions against specific Chinese individuals responsible for carrying out the atrocities in Xinjiang. I think that can be helpful as well to expand the universe of, to expand our voice to work with other nations, perhaps through the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and your parliamentary exchanges with the Japanese, the Australians, and others.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Burns, thank you for your prior service and your willingness to serve in this capacity. I agree with you that if we act intelligently, the U.S. in concert with our allies in the West, we can compete with China. China, though, has advantages in terms of very long-term, very strategic thinking, authoritarian. They don't have the back and forth of elections, that type of thing. So they have utilized that long-term strategic thinking, while the West literally has not done much to counter their infiltration into our institutions, their stealing of our intellectual property since their entry into the WTO. And just like you to comment on how do we counter what they've done and how do we do that effectively?
Senator, thank you. I think it's a central question. We have to have a strategy to match China's strategy. I think that is beginning to develop over the last several years in the last 3 administrations, President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden. And as I said in my testimony, what distinguishes us and strengthens us is the fact that we have our alliance with Japan and our alliance with Australia and South Korea. And I've been involved in my past diplomatic career in intensive discussions with the Europeans. I think they're less united, perhaps, in the European Union right now, but I sense that the Europeans are shifting to understand the threat to them, as well as to us and our Indo-Pacific allies. So I think operating on an allied basis is the most important thing we can do. And sometimes that means we form institutions. So the Quad is an institution that both parties can be proud of. Republican and Democratic presidents have supported the Quad. And now President Biden is operationalizing at the head of government level, which we hadn't done before. AUKUS, 3 countries coming together. We need to build the institutions that are permanent and that take this policy that we're discussing this morning into the 2030s, because the competition with China will be multi-decade.
Yeah, I do want to address specifically their infiltration into our university systems, the Confucius Institutes, their investment in things like medical journals. It really concerns me. You know, there is so much we don't know, for example, about the coronavirus, so much we don't know about COVID. I really do, and I really want to get your take on a real potential fault line when we start learning more. For example, about the origin theory. I mean, I don't know whether it was lab leak, whether it's natural origin. People are starting to look into that. Obviously, there was a cover-up here for 18 months, and as a result, gave China a really good head start at bearing evidence. But back in March of 2020, you participated in a virtual event at the Harvard's Kennedy Center, and you definitely were critical of China, saying that this was, an army exercise. But at the same time, you're very critical of President Trump for calling it the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. He said that we all know that's wrong. We all know that's racist. We all know that's not true. I guess I'm kind of wondering, how did you know? We still don't know. How are you so positive that this wasn't a lab leak theory? And have you changed your mind? Have you seen other evidence that would at least open up your mind to that prospect? Because if it is determined that it probably was not a natural origin, and this did leak from a lab in Wuhan, that will have very serious geopolitical repercussions in our relationship with China.
Thank you, Senator. I want to agree with you briefly on the issue of students and exchanges. We ought to welcome Chinese students into the United States, but student visas are not a right. They have to be earned. Our laws have to be observed. There are some Chinese student applicants who have ties to the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and China's intelligence services, and we should turn them down for visas. And we have to be clear about that. But we also have 375,000 students in our universities and secondary schools in your state and my state, at my university, and we are better off having them in this country to learn about our democracy. On the coronavirus, the problem here is with China. The Chinese government withheld information very clearly from their own people and the rest of the world for about a month in late December and January of 2020. I have consistently criticized the Chinese government for that, and they deserve to be criticized. And they've been stonewalling all of us around the world since January of 2020, including this week when they refused to act to work with the World Health Organization's new investigative body to answer the question that you rightfully asked.
But again, my question is, are you still so certain that lab leak is off the table? Because you were very certain back then. You said it was, we all know that's not true. Have you changed your thinking on that? Because I think it's important, if you're going to be ambassador to China, that you have a more open mind on this than you exhibited back in March of 2020.
So, Senator, I spoke often about this issue of U.S.-China relations at that period of time. And I believe that quote from the Kennedy School event was directed to President Trump's use of the term Wuhan virus, which I did not think would be effective with the Chinese government or Chinese people or people around the world. It had nothing to do with the origins of the crisis of the pandemic. My position has been all along and continues this day, we need to investigate. We don't know how this virus originated for sure. There are multiple theories, and the Chinese need to answer the questions. So I have never been a proponent of either one of these two options, but I think, as President Biden has said, we need to push the Chinese to come clean about what happened.
Well, thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador Burns, thank you for your willingness to continue to serve the United States. As I'm sure you're aware, there have been reported cases of anomalous health incidents in China, also known as Havana syndrome cases. Have you been briefed on the reported cases in China?
Senator, I do not have a security clearance, so I've not been briefed in detail about what has happened to our mission personnel there, but I've had unclassified, open conversations with the State Department, and what I would say to you is my own view, just as a private citizen, is that this is real. It's happening to our diplomats and other government personnel all around the world, and if confirmed, my obligation to you, and more particularly to the men and women of our mission in China, is to do everything under my power to protect them, working with the Secretary of State and all of our other officials.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I hope you will also request from the State Department, once confirmed, that classified briefing that also includes how to encourage personnel to respond if they are affected and what to look for in terms of those attacks, because to date, there doesn't seem to be a consistent response and direction for personnel.
Thank you.
You mentioned in your opening remarks and in the questioning about the increased Chinese influence in Eastern Europe and also Lithuania, which is one example of an Eastern European country that has taken a hard stance on China. In July, they actually became the first European country to allow a Taiwanese diplomatic presence using the island's name in the country. Can you talk about what you think the impact of Lithuania's stance is? We know it's produced a response from China, but will it have impact on other Eastern European countries and encourage them to take a hard look at what China's doing?
Thank you. Lithuania has chosen its course, and every country has a right to define its relationship with Taiwan. And I'm proud that the Biden administration has stood up for Lithuania. And, you know, it's extraordinary. The Chinese government has launched an intensive intimidation campaign, economic intimidation of Lithuania, and the Lithuanians have stood up and they've held their ground. They deserve our support, as Australia does, and Australia has been subjected to the same treatment. We have our own policy, the One China policy, which we should adhere to, our unofficial relationship with Taiwan, which has served us well. Every other country should have a right to determine what they want to do, and they shouldn't be bludgeoned and bullied by the Chinese leadership.
Well, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more with that, and I think Lithuania deserves a lot of credit for a small country being willing to stand up in the way that they have. Excuse me. Earlier this month, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg insisted that NATO must engage politically with China, but the alliance doesn't seem to see China as much of a threat as they do Russia. Does China view NATO in the same way? And what do you think NATO's strategy should be towards China?
Thank you, Senator. It's been really interesting for me as a former ambassador to NATO to see how high on the agenda China has become over the last couple of years during President Trump's time and now President Biden's time. And the focus is right. I mean, certainly Russia is the immediate focus of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and especially considering Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland right up on the front lines as we try to contain Russian power. But I think the NATO countries, led by a great Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, also understand China, as the Belt Road Initiative, is now in 16 countries in Eastern Europe. The Chinese are actively trying to separate countries in Eastern Europe from the European Union and NATO. And if you think about Chinese energy activities and military activities in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, which is part of the NATO littoral geography, and think about the interests of Germany, of France, Italy, any of the NATO countries, they've got to be concerned by what's happening in Xinjiang province, in what's happened to Hong Kong, the threats against Taiwan, and the economic practices of China. My last point would be, if we can coalesce with the European Union, the United States, and Japan on some of the economic issues, we're well more than 60% of GDP. It's real leverage. So Europe has to be part of this strategy, and I credit the Secretary General. I credit Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchison, who was our great American ambassador under President Trump. She pushed this issue, and she was right to do that.
And do you think China has become concerned about NATO's increasing interest in what China is doing in Europe?
The reason
or are they ignoring that?
I don't think they're ignoring it, Senator. I mean, the reason I use the term China's not an Olympian power in my statement, and I meant it specifically, they have enormous strengths. They have very few friends. They have no real allies. And think of the strategic advantage we have with our 29 allies in Canada, the Europeans in NATO, and our multiple treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific. It is our comparative advantage, and I think President Biden has been working overtime with Secretary Blinken to reach out to the allies, both in NATO and the Indo-Pacific, to say we need to be working together strategically on China.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me just quickly echo Senator Shaheen's comments about Lithuania. Lithuania and how we respond to help it is a test for the West. Because when a country stands up against China and then faces the enormous economic consequences that China is creating against Lithuanian businesses by denying them supply chain opportunities, which is a wake-up call for the world, I think it's incredibly important that we stand by Lithuania extremely strongly. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wish to associate myself with the comments of the chairman and the ranking member at the beginning of this hearing. It's good to see you, Ambassador, and very deeply appreciate your willingness to serve once again your country at a critical time. We all know China's ambition. They've described what it is. They seek to replace us as the global leader. The prospect of a global order led by China is one which is troubling for many reasons. We can see what that might look like based upon what they're doing even now, censoring their media, blacking out social media in their country, stealing intellectual property from us and from others, reneging on treaties and promises they've made, repressing religion and people of faith, monitoring their own citizens and assigning social grades based upon their loyalty to the Chinese regime, the communist regime, oppressing minorities of all kinds, and, of course, committing genocide. We say that quickly, but genocide, eliminating a people, enslaving a people as they are, all these things suggest that a global order led by China would be something which the world could not possibly endure. There was probably a time, a decade or so ago, when if you were the ambassador to China, you could go in and pound your fist on the table and they would take note and perhaps change course on some of the things we care most about because they were worried about their access to the U.S. market. Is that true today? Can we sort of tell China what to do and do they respond or are we no longer in that position?
Senator, thank you, and I appreciate the conversation we had in your office 2 weeks ago about all these issues. I think our relationship is fundamentally different now than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and I've spoken to most of the former American ambassadors about this, and we're in an entirely new age where we've got to have channels of communication to work with the Chinese. First of all, we want to mitigate the danger of an accidental conflict. We want to maintain the peace. But we also want to have clear messaging in, and I think multiple channels make sense. If confirmed, I'll be on point for the country and the government in Beijing, talking directly to the Chinese. I think it's very important for members to travel there, members of Congress, and ultimately most important for the president to have direct conversations as he is seeking to do. He's had phone conversations with President Xi Jinping, but these are difficult conversations, and you've seen the aggressiveness of the Chinese officials. You've seen the nationalism. You've seen the wolf warrior diplomacy. It's part of the fabric of what we're dealing with now. And my final point, Senator, would be to say we're a strong country. We should be confident of our values and our interests, and we can stand up to the Chinese. But our allies and partners can help to do that so that there's real weight and leverage, and I do think that's the focus.
What is your sense of the commitment of our allies to that effort? We've spoken already this morning about NATO and our friends and allies there. Perhaps Germany is not quite as committed as, let's say, Lithuania. But as you look at our allies, are we advancing in terms of our mutual efforts, or is there some retreat on the part of key allies?
I don't see retreat. Certainly, I think we're seeing a stiffening of the resolve of Japan, which is so important for us. Australia, rock solid on these issues. India, not an ally, not a treaty ally, but a strategic military partner in the Bay of Bengal and the Western Pacific. Very important for us. Europe is different. There's so many countries with different views. Of course, we're waiting for the formation of the German government, so we'll have to wait and to see what the Social Democrats and the Greens do. But I would note that the Greens were very critical of China during the recent campaign in Germany. And certainly President Macron has spoken out about the dangers of China in the Indo-Pacific. And France is unique among the European powers because it is an Indo-Pacific country as well. And so I think we've got to work both the North Atlantic Alliance, the European Union, but especially our Indo-Pacific allies to be successful.
There are some who look at China and say it's a juggernaut. There's no way to slow it down. It's on a course that is unstoppable. Do you see it that way? Is there a way of dissuading China from a course as malevolent as what we're seeing today? Do they have some fundamental weaknesses that the rest of the world recognizes and can get them to divert from the course they're on?
It's certainly yours is certainly a key analytical question, and none of us can deny the extraordinary growth in the power of China militarily, technologically, economically, and politically over the last 30 to 40 years. But we shouldn't exaggerate that power. I said in my statement, China has significant demographic challenges over the next few decades. It has angered nearly all the countries on its border by being overly aggressive and overly acquisitive. Think of the South China Sea and the outrageous attempts by the Chinese government to run roughshod over the Law of the Sea Treaty and the legal obligations that China is ignoring. Think of the East China Sea and their attempt to intimidate, but they have not succeeded, our ally Japan, and think of Taiwan. And so I think the Chinese have, by being so aggressive, they've now stirred up a lot of opposition to them. And I think we ought not to exaggerate their strengths or underestimate the strengths of the United States. What we need is self-confidence, that the United States is a strong country. And I do think our values are the strongest part of our strategy towards China.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you, Ambassador Burns, for your willingness to continue your service overseas. You are the right nominee at the right moment for what is an absolutely critical relationship for the 21st century. And I think in your opening statement, you laid out wisely the challenges that are before us. And so I am particularly pleased, given your deep experience in the Foreign Service as ambassador to Greece and to NATO, your work leading the Aspen Strategy Group, through which I've gotten to see your remarkable talents of both strategic insight and interpersonal diplomacy. And my thanks to Libby, to the support you've gotten from your spouse and your family across a long career in service. Just a few questions, if I might, because I know there are many others who have questions. But first, I think part of what you bring to this is an understanding of how to effectively deploy that key strategic advantage of allies and partners. And I think you correctly point out that China's greatest current global weakness is the absence of any real partners or allies. So given your experience as ambassador first to Greece and then later to NATO, how do you envision the U.S.-Europe transatlantic alliance responding to the strategic competition with China, the values competition, and how do you think you can best play a role in engaging our allies in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe?
Senator, thank you very much for those comments and for your question. In my entire diplomatic career, probably the lesson I learned most vividly was 9/11. When I was a very new ambassador, I was in my 12th day, and we were hit hard, 3,000 people dead in the United States. And we couldn't reach the Pentagon, the White House, and the State Department because they'd all been evacuated, but my phone started to ring. at NATO headquarters. And it was the Canadian ambassador, David Wright, and the German ambassador and the Italian and French ambassadors. We're with you. We want to invoke Article 5. That's the bond. We invoked Article 5 the next day. And that's the bond we have in our allies. And it's based in part on strategic interests that we have in common, but it's fundamentally based on values and belief in democracy and human rights. And that's the coalition that we need to form vis-a-vis China. And I credit President Biden. When he came to office, from his inaugural speech to his first speech in the State Department to his G7 and NATO and EU meetings, and you know this very well, Senator, because you're so close to him, he has been consistent in saying we're going to succeed most if we're with our allies. And Secretary Blinken has been working tirelessly on this. And I think it is going to be, frankly, most challenging perhaps in Europe. It's not the fault of the Europeans, but it's a big group of countries and a multiplicity of views. NATO is, in one way, the right institution for certain issues, and we're working those there, but the European Union on others. And I would just say, and we had a chance to talk about this morning together, we need to be together on human rights. We need to stand up together, Europeans and Americans, on the Uyghur issue, on Tibet, on Hong Kong, and on Taiwan. And we need to be together on trade because both of us are victims of Chinese unfair trade practices. And think of the power of the EU, the US, perhaps Japan working together. I think that's part of the strategy that we have to operate.
Thank you, Ambassador. I do think we're in an era where concerns about the digital world and the role of the individual in a digital age are also at the forefront. I'm very concerned about the way in which China has developed and deployed the technology to surveil and to censor, to even control its own population, and actions they've taken to export not just that technology, but that attitude to other countries around the world. How do you think we can best work with global partners to offer an alternative vision in which digital technologies serve democratic values, and then to embed that in a common trade framework with the values partners you were just referencing?
Thank you, Senator. This is also a central question. And President Biden, from his inaugural speech on, has been talking about the need for democracies to recognize the threat from the authoritarian world. And that's principally the People's Republic of China and Russia and others around the world. And to see the pernicious misuse of technology to repress their own citizens, and then to try to export that technology in countries where there's a struggle between democratic, small d, democratic forces and authoritarian forces. We've got to be operating all across the world to help the democratic forces and to help blunt this technological impact. I think it's a very important issue. I know the State Department and Secretary Blinken are seized by it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I look forward to supporting your nomination, to working closely with you. I think better understanding China, better communicating with China about our risks and opportunities is an important and critical role, but also clearly advocating for America's interests and values is an essential role, and I think you'll be an excellent ambassador. Look forward to supporting your nomination. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Barrasso.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Burns, welcome to the committee. The Chinese Communist Party cannot be trusted. The world has seen China's brutality, deception, illegal activities. We've seen China cover up, spread disinformation about the coronavirus. We've seen China destroy Hong Kong's autonomy. We've seen them engage in unlawful military activities in the South China Sea. We've seen China steal American intellectual property, commit terrible human rights abuses. Now, these, to me, are actions of a dangerous and authoritarian regime. It's not a nation committed to the rule of law, to free markets, to protecting the rights of people. It's clear the United States and the international community must hold China accountable for its increasingly dangerous behavior. So just recently, the CIA Director Bill Byrne stated that China presents the greatest challenge to U.S. interests and to international order, close quote. He also announced the creation of a new China Mission Center to, quote, strengthen our collective work on the most important geopolitical threat that we face in the 21st century, which is an increasingly adversarial Chinese government. Do you concur and believe that China's increasingly adversarial government is the most important geopolitical threat that the United States faces in the 21st century?
Thank you, Senator. I agree with my longtime friend and Foreign Service colleague, Director Bill Burns. I agree with the statement he made. I noticed it. I read his statement. He and I grew up in the first 10 years of our career were the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was the greatest threat. There's no question in the 21st century, given Chinese power that we've talked about this morning, China is the greatest threat to the security of our country and of the democratic world.
Thank you. I want to ask you about the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement. Remember, January of 2020, the United States and China signed a Phase 1 trade agreement. China committed to buy $468 billion of U.S. goods, energy, agriculture, and services over a 2-year period of time. They really do. China appears to be failing to comply to this agreement. Reports indicate that China's purchases have fallen far short for both 2020 and 2021. Do you believe China is committed to abiding by its promises under this agreement, and what are options available to us to ensure that China does fulfill the terms of the agreement?
Thank you, Senator. This is going to be a contentious issue, and it has been for a long time between our two countries. I think you know that the U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Catherine Tai, gave a speech here in Washington 2.5 weeks ago, and she was very forthright in saying, I'll just summarize her main point, saying that she would talk to her Chinese counterpart about that Phase 1 deal and about the performance of the Chinese government in meeting or not meeting its commitments. And I think she was right to suggest that that has to be the first order of business on trade with China. And obviously, we in the United States need to make investments in our own economy to strengthen it, which the President and Congress are working on. And we have to overcome the ravages of COVID-19 before we can probably get on to bigger initiatives. But I think she was right to start there, hold China to account for what it promised President Trump. And I think most observers and experts would say they have not fulfilled their obligations.
In addition to goods and energy and agriculture products, there's also intellectual property obligations under this U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement. What steps can we take to ensure that China fully implements and complies with the intellectual property commitment?
That's a key issue, because it gets to the systemic violations of China's WTO commitments. I named some of them in my statement: intellectual property theft, dumping, state subsidies, unfair labor practices. So when we talk to the Chinese about trade, part of it is our two-way $559 billion trade relationship in goods and then more in services. Part of it is getting at these systemic problems that I think every recent president has wrestled the Chinese on.
For my final question, earlier this year, China and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding in which China would invest as much as $400 billion in Iran over the next 25 years. Last month, Iran was accepted as a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China's long been importing Iranian oil in contravention of U.S. sanctions on Iran. Sanctioned Iranian airlines continue to fly to China. Not simply a matter of a few Chinese companies violating U.S. law. There's a lot going on here. It appears to be a strategic decision by the Chinese government to allow these violations to take place. What's your assessment of the current relationship between China and Iran?
This is a very serious issue. As you portray it, and you're right, this is a closer relationship than China and Iran had, say, when I was the Iran negotiator for Secretary Condoleezza Rice. When China joined us in 3 UN Security Council sanctions resolutions, Chapter 7, against the Iranians in 2006, 7, and 8. And now they have a closer relationship. I think what we ought to do, and we will do, I'm sure, and the President Biden's administration, talk to the Chinese directly about this, and obviously hold the Chinese to account to abide by every UN Security Council sanctions resolution that prohibits most of this activity.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your long service to the nation, for your willingness to continue in a very difficult but critical post. When the Obama administration negotiated the Paris Accords, it was critical that they secure commitments from the fastest growing economies, which happen to be the fastest growing polluters, to make significant commitments. Of course, India and China are at the top of this list. We lost 4 years in holding both of those nations to their commitments. And so you and this administration are going to be making up for lost time. India is arguably, in the neighborhood of being able to make their commitment at Paris. China is not. In fact, a recent report found that Chinese emissions in 2019 were so big that they were larger than that of the entire developed world as a whole. And so I'd be interested to hear from you, what you believe are the commitments that can be realistically made by the Chinese, especially in the short term as we get ready for COP26, and the extent to which our ability to pass significant climate legislation will enable you to be a more forceful interlocutor with the Chinese on questions of climate.
Thank you, Senator. Another central question, and this is the side of the relationship where we have to engage China and seek cooperation if it's possible. And this makes this relationship so difficult because we're competing and we're engaging at the same time. Climate is perhaps the signature issue on the cooperation side. And obviously, President Obama was able to work with President Xi Jinping back in 2015. That was positive. Former Secretary John Kerry is now working tirelessly on this issue. And China, as I understand China's current position, its emissions will not begin to diminish until 2030. And most climate experts, if not all, think that's not sustainable. That China needs to make a greater effort to diminish its carbon emissions before 2030. And also they say they'll be carbon neutral by 2060. It's got to be well before that. Because you're right, China is by far the largest emitter of carbon in the world today, by a long mile past the United States and any other country. And so they have an obligation to the rest of us, beginning at COP26 and going on. This will be a major issue in our relationship.
I want to ask you second about your assessment of the scope and breadth of Chinese diplomacy today. There was a sort of flurry of attention to a milestone in 2019 where China surpassed the United States with respect to the number of diplomatic posts it has around the world. I was in Ireland that same year where there was an important telecommunications tender, and we were hearing stories about a surge of diplomats being sent to the embassy in Dublin. Meanwhile, we had one very nice and capable military attaché who was the beginning and end of our diplomatic team working on behalf of U.S. companies for this tender. It seems as if China has diplomatic reach in new places and has an ability to be flexible and nimble in a way that we do not. One of the things that I believe we should be engaging in is more subnational diplomacy, using our state leaders and our local leaders to engage all around the world on behalf of the United States, something that China does fairly well. Just a quick assessment from you as to the state of Chinese diplomatic efforts around the world, how it's changed over the past 5 or 10 years, and any recommendations that you might give to this committee as we seek to empower U.S. diplomacy to compete with China.
Thank you, Senator. The Chinese have sought to become the most active in their minds and most powerful diplomatic force in the world for my entire career. Until a couple of years ago, the United States had more embassies and consulates in the world than any country. As of last autumn, China had 275 embassies and consulates, and the United States 273. Is it meaningful? Yes. It means we have to compete. We're competing militarily. We're competing economically. We've got to compete diplomatically. I can assure you we have an outstanding foreign service. I've gotten to know over the last couple of months the men and women of the China desk in our East Asia Bureau. They're superb experts. And we do need to make a commitment, as the President and Secretary Blinken are doing, to modernize, strengthen our foreign service and our civil service. And that's part of our diplomatic power. And finally, Senator, I think you're right. Diplomacy is not just for people like me, State Department diplomats. We need multiple channels to create the coalitions and friendships that can limit China, and that can be state governors and legislatures and NGOs, subnational actors, as you call them. And I think we've got to have an all-country embrace of connecting with our allies to support our interests vis-a-vis China.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Haggerty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Burns, nice to have you here today. I'd like to talk with you about China's strategy to dominate the 21st century. We just learned over the weekend that China has deployed for the first time what's known as a hypersonic glide missile. As the Financial Times reported, I'm going to quote, China tested a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile in August that circled the globe before speeding toward its target, demonstrating an advanced space capability that caught U.S. intelligence by surprise. If China deployed hypersonic glide vehicles, this would enable China to circumvent U.S. ballistic missile defenses and strike the U.S. homeland without warning. Ambassador Burns, this new military capability is deeply worrisome. But I believe the even bigger alarm is continued complacency about China, complacency that we still see far too much in the national security establishment here in America. We see this when China probes and menaces our democratic ally, Taiwan, and the administration responds with silence or with presidential talk about a so-called Taiwan agreement that doesn't exist. Xi Jinping has made clear that the Chinese Communist Party has a plan for China to dominate the world diplomatically, economically, technologically, and militarily. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party want to achieve dominance and displace the United States by 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And they're certainly locking in every advantage that they can along the way. President Trump awakened our nation to the Chinese threat, and the Biden administration has inherited a very strong China strategy, one that I helped to craft and implement when I served as U.S. Ambassador to Japan. As part of the China strategy, the Trump administration also rightly determined that China is engaged in genocide and crimes against humanity with the Uyghur population and other Muslims that live in the Xinjiang province. I worry that the Biden administration will try to strike some sort of naive grand bargain on climate or other issues with China that effectively might erase the strong position that we have with China today. Such a naive deal could significantly weaken our energy independence. Meanwhile, China will continue to burn more coal and emit more greenhouse gases than all of the developed world combined, with an unenforceable pledge to reduce their carbon footprint at some undetermined time in the future. Ambassador Burns, that's my view of what's at stake strategically, but let's focus on China's immediate threat with respect to Taiwan. It's clear that the Chinese Communist Party is stepping up its military posture in the Taiwan Strait. The world's alarmed, and Taiwan could be the first domino to fall in the Indo-Pacific. Ambassador, what's your view on the Taiwan issue? And should the United States revisit the issue of strategic ambiguity with respect to Taiwan?
Senator, thank you, and thank you for your service as a U.S. Ambassador to Japan. I agree with you that China is our strongest, I would say most dangerous competitor in the world. President Biden has followed a very tough-minded policy against China. I counted up yesterday at least 15 sanctions or executive orders limiting the ability of the Chinese government to be influential around the world or in our own society. So I think there's been, under President Obama, President Trump, now President Biden, an increasing emphasis on what we need to do to limit China. And President Biden's policy is very tough and very strong. On Taiwan, we need to do multiple things. We need to strengthen our commitment to Taiwan's security under the Taiwan Relations Act. The Biden administration proposed the sale of A109A6 howitzers this past spring, a $750 million deal that would help the Taiwan authorities to defend themselves. There's substantial leverage in the Taiwan Relations Act available to the executive and legislative branches to continue to provide arms sales for defensive purposes, defense articles and services to Taiwan. And maybe the most important thing we can do is maintain a strong American military deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. You were part of that as ambassador. Our alliance with Japan, our alliance with the Republic of Korea, our alliance with Australia, the presence of our Navy and Air Force at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, our rotational deployments, of course, our deployments through the international waters of the South China Sea. This is all-encompassing strategy designed to support our side and to strengthen our ability to help Taiwan defend itself.
I agree with you on our military strategy and our posture. We need to maintain it. We need to strengthen it. I am interested still, though, in your view on whether we should revisit our posture of strategic ambiguity, how we talk about the Taiwan situation.
This is an important question. My own view is that we're better off and will be more effective in staying with the one China policy of the last 4 decades. We recognize the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. And yet we have unofficial relations with Taiwan, and we have under the Taiwan Relations Act the ability, in fact the imperative, of helping Taiwan to defend itself. Every president, Republican and Democrat, has followed that policy in the face of the Chinese buildup, and they're more aggressive now. That is the best way for us to strengthen the ability of Taiwan to defend itself.
My time has come to a close. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Ambassador Burns, I'm sitting in while Senator Menendez votes, and it's my turn in the order, so congratulations to you. You're a wonderful public servant. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about assumptions. So pre-2000, China had to sort of make a case to the United States every year to be granted most favored nation status. And it was an annual decision that the president would make. And China, that annual decision provided a forum for discussions about human rights issues and such. In 2000, Congress granted China permanent normal trade relations status, which paved their path to becoming a member of the WTO. And so we no longer have that annual determination and opportunity. And I think possibly we've lost some focus on some of the human rights and other issues for that reason. The decision was made because of a belief that if China was part of the WTO, they would conform themselves to global trade rules. And I think everyone, whatever their thought at the time, would say that China's behavior has been disappointing, that they haven't done what we hoped. I'm curious, do you think that was a mistake for us to grant China legal permanent trade relations in 2000?
Thank you, Senator Kaine. I was not involved in U.S.-China relations at that time. I was focused on Greece and NATO in those years. And of course, it's always perilous to be a Monday morning quarterback and sit in judgment of people I really admire. But personally, the assumptions that many made about China in those years turned out not to be accurate. China took advantage of its presence in the WTO as a so-called developing country. China then didn't meet its obligations under the WTO, and who suffered? American workers and American businesses. And you and I have met with a lot of American businesses who had their IP ripped off by the Chinese and made their business decisions very difficult. So I do think at this point in 2021, I hope there will be bipartisan support for a very aggressive American policy to hold China to account. And if you read Ambassador Tai's speech of 2.5 weeks ago, Ambassador Catherine Tai's speech, the U.S. trade rep, she was very clear about her determination on behalf of the president to protect American workers and protect American businesses. And I think that has to be the focus of our efforts right now.
Thank you for that answer. Some of my Republican colleagues actually have filed a bill to undo the legal permanent trade relations that we accorded China 21 years ago. It might be hard to get the genie back in the bottle because supply chains and others have sort of reformed and recombined to reflect the new reality. But I think with the best of intentions, there were a lot of optimism and hopes about China. Members of both parties, presidents of both parties that have proven to be wrong. And we have to be willing, as we were with the Competitiveness Act we recently passed, to lean much more forward in the relationship. Here's another assumption, and you've touched on it in your discussion. The United States has a wonderful network of allies, but China really doesn't. China really doesn't. And we see this again and again. I think it's a statement that is actually true. But here's something I worry about. When I see China and Russia doing joint naval exercises in the Straits of Japan, as they recently did, or other joint military exercises, they've done joint military exercises with Iran in the Persian Gulf. I start to worry a little bit about an assumption that we've long made in national security thinking, that China and Russia will never be but too cooperative. They seem to be combining frequently now. They are very different countries, but they both are authoritarian nations that don't respect democratic norms and institutions and actually believe democracy is a dying governmental model. How worried should the United States be about increasing cooperation between China and Russia, especially on military matters?
It's a reality. And I think a lot of us, maybe 10, 20 years ago, would not have anticipated that China and Russia would begin to work together strategically, but they are. All the more reason why we need to deepen our own alliances and partnerships. I'd say this, Senator, and this is just speculative. I spent 5 years of my career at the White House on Soviet and Russian affairs. My numbers may be a little bit off, but I think there are 6 or 7 million Russians living east of the Ural Mountains in that vast expanse. And there are 300 or 400 million Chinese living below them. The Russians are going to have to worry long term about economic domination of Russia by China. And in response to what Senator Risch asked me, the Russians ought to be worried about a Chinese nuclear weapons buildup in the western part of China, about the hypersonic missile that Senator Haggerty test that Senator Haggerty just raised, and the fact that China is completely unconstrained. Of the 5 permanent nuclear powers of the Security Council, it's the only one that refuses to be part of any arms control regime. We've been part of one for 60 years, since the Test Ban Treaty of 1963. And so obviously that's going to be a focus for all of us, I would say, including the Russians going forward.
Thank you. I'm over my time. I believe Senator Young by WebEx is next up.
Yes, Senator Kane. Chairman, thank you so much. Yes, Mr. Burns, I'm sorry I just hopped on, Ambassador, but congratulations on your nomination and thank you for your years of distinguished service. This week, we've seen public reporting suggesting that China successfully tested a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile. Earlier this summer, we saw additional reporting indicating that China had dramatically increased the size and scope of its nuclear arsenal. These reports have evoked fears of a new Cold War with China. These nuclear weapons concerns come amid rapidly escalating tensions over Taiwan. Our strategic competition, of course, is nothing new, but I'm concerned with the growing risks of miscommunication or misinterpretation of our actions. In your view, sir, what's motivating these sorts of provocative actions from Beijing?
Senator Young, thank you, and thank you for your leadership on the strategic innovation bill that is so important to the future of our country. I think you're right to focus on this issue. Part of what we will need to do in the U.S.-China relationship is mitigate the possibility of an accidental conflict and to maintain the peace between our two countries and in the region. And that will require our military leadership, the civilian leadership of the Defense Department, the State Department, and the White House to have effective communication channels into the Chinese leadership. And of course, every administration has wanted to do this and has worked on it, but we need to work on it very intensively because at all costs, we want to compete with China, but we don't want to find ourselves, in the words of my Harvard colleague Joe Nye, being sleepwalkers into a conflict with China. So part of the job of an American ambassador to China, if I'm confirmed, will be to work with my colleagues in the U.S. government to make sure we have those effective communications channels with the Chinese leadership. And finally, Senator, I just say to you, I completely agree with you. We should all be concerned by the nuclear buildup in China. And that has to be a concern for allied nations as well as the United States.
Well, thank you. I wish you luck. If there's any way Congress can be constructive in helping open up those channels of communication, whether it's through visits to the country, expressing our collective desire to make sure that we're talking and we avoid any scenarios that our leadership and our peoples would regret, I am enlist me in the cause, sir.
Thank you.
My state of Indiana, Ambassador, is the most manufacturing-intensive state in the United States, and our businesses rely on a diversified supply chain and market access. Over the years, China has used localization requirements, intellectual property theft, and forced transfer of data to hamstring our enterprises that are dependent on technology. I firmly believe the United States should advocate for integrity in digital trade provisions of our trade agreements. This includes holding bad actors accountable, especially Communist China. I'm currently working on a resolution to solidify the U.S. commitment to high standard digital trade principles. If confirmed, how will you address continued action by China that purposefully causes harm to American businesses, knowing that you'll need to coordinate with Ambassador Tai on this?
Senator, thank you. And in my opening statement, I focused on this issue of trade because of the enormous damage to your state and every other state, to our workers and to our businesses. This is a high priority for the Biden administration, and obviously, if confirmed, I'll be working very intensively on this issue with the White House, with the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, and of course, principally with Ambassador Tai and her colleagues.
Ambassador, accept my apologies if you discussed this in your opening statement, but could you just explain why actions like IP theft and data localization requirements are issues of national security, not just economic issues?
In thinking about this job, I've been consulting with a lot of experts on China across the country, and it's really been interesting to hear that I think the great majority of them would say that the focal point, the most important part of our competition with China, will be on economics and technology in the future. We're going to have a military competition for power, which we had with the Soviets in the old Cold War. What distinguishes our competition with China, which makes it unlike the old Cold War, is the fact that they seek dominance on technology, on AI, machine learning, quantum sciences, biotechnology. They seek to militarize those technologies. That may be the central focus of the competition. So therefore, we in the executive branch and you in Congress need to unite on a bipartisan basis and be fundamentally focused on it.
Thank you.
And I would say, Ambassador, thank you for bringing up my legislation. That is the purpose, to address this threat, technology threat, economic threat that China poses to us, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. So I hope that broadly bipartisan legislation passes before year's end. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for your leadership.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for your long service to this country and to your family. Just picking up on some of the points Senator Young made, and I was pleased to hear you mention in your opening remarks the issue of China's systematic theft of intellectual property. That's why Senator Sass and I teamed up and we passed a bipartisan bill here in the Senate called Protecting American Intellectual Property Act. It's actually incorporated in the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which, as you know, passed the Senate and is pending in the House. And the whole idea is that U.S. companies that are victimized by intellectual property theft don't have just sole recourse in the United States court. And so in those situations where we're not talking about garden variety, trademark, violations, but in fact, systematic theft of U.S. strategic technology and other cutting-edge technologies, the U.S. government would weigh in and be authorized to impose economic sanctions and penalties. This was a measure supported by the previous administration, I think also by the current administration. I want to flag that because I look forward to working with you as we get that through the congressional process, because there has to be a price to pay And when you're talking about the Chinese government weighing in and being part of this theft, you can't leave it simply to the court system to defend American companies. Similarly, I believe China's got to be paying a higher price for its malign actions and its violation of international agreements. And we've seen a gross violation of those agreements in the case of Hong Kong, where China has cracked down on democracy. Senator Toomey and I passed legislation last year called the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. It's in part of the law now. This administration has used it to apply sanctions to 24 individuals who are complicit in cracking down on democracy in Hong Kong. We'd like to see them identify some of the banks and financial institutions that are aiding and abetting that activity, because the sanctions also apply to them. But my broader question here relates to how we raise the price China's got to pay for these malign actions. Yes, we've got to make sure we strengthen our own position, both at home and around the world, certainly with our allies, certainly provide Taiwan with more of the means to defend itself. But how can we raise the cost to China of the kind of actions they've taken in Hong Kong? And do you agree that they've felt the pain at all of international response, for example, in Hong Kong? Is there more we can be doing?
Senator, thank you very much, and thank you for authoring that legislation. I do think it was particularly effective to sanction specific individuals in Hong Kong who are responsible for the repression of the people of Hong Kong, and that's similar to the Biden administration sanctions on those individuals in Xinjiang province who did the same. I do think that we are stronger if we can create global alliances on all of these issues. So encouraging the European Union to be with us, not just in condemning human rights violations, but sanctioning, and that was the case. They were with us in sanctions on Xinjiang. And I think Hong Kong's particularly important. I mentioned earlier in the testimony, I was with Secretary Albright in Hong Kong on the day of the handover, June 30, 1997. And all of us with Secretary Albright remember the specific commitments China made, and it's reneged on all of them. So this is not just a U.S. concern, it has to be a global concern. And I do think one of the changes President Biden has brought to our strategic policy towards China is to emphasize our allies and partners on this issue as well as the others that we've been talking about.
I appreciate that. I think you have to have that multiplier effect in order to make these sanctions ultimately effective. If not in reversing the actions that China has taken, letting them know that they will pay a higher price for similar actions going forward. Just in conclusion, you're obviously going to be our ambassador to China and talking about these important issues between our two countries, but how important is it that we strengthen ourselves here at home, both in terms of modernizing our infrastructure and trying to address the depolarization that we face in this country?
It may be the most important thing we can do, is to invest in our technological future as the Senate is doing with your strategic innovation bill, which I very strongly, that the administration very strongly supported, and I do too. And it's to prepare ourselves to strengthen, to have a clean energy future, strengthen our technology base, be funding, I would hope, our universities and research institutions, because that's where the cutting edge technology is happening, supporting our businesses, because they're the ones who make America powerful economically in large part. And so that strategy is probably the most important thing we can do to stand up to the China challenge. Over the next 20 to 30 years, I do think this is going to be a long-term challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Burns, first of all, let me just begin by saying thank you for the time that you spent with us last evening. It is appreciated, and I most certainly enjoyed the conversation. As you know, I sit on the Senate Armed Services Committee and its Strategic Forces Subcommittee. I'd be very interested in your thoughts on China's nuclear stockpile and its expanding capabilities, specifically with regard to our challenge right now here within the discussions going on that some of our members think it's okay if we were to perhaps not modernize our own triad. In fact, they question whether anybody really cares whether we have a triad or not. China, and this is on an unclassified level, they've been increasing their stockpile. Some folks don't think that we need to be improving and upgrading and modernizing our own nuclear triad. I think China is aggressively growing their own, and I think this is a critical part of their foreign policy strategy. And I think it's one way in which the PRC, in terms of their diplomatic efforts, uses it as a hammer when they deal with other countries. Could you share a little bit about how you see that impacting your ability to negotiate with the PRC once you are there?
Senator, thank you, and thank you for the conversation we had in your office last evening. And as I explained to you, one of the curiosities of coming up for confirmation as a private citizen is that, quite properly, I don't have access to classified information. So in this realm, and Senator Haggerty asked me about it as well, I'm a little bit limited by not having that access. But I will say this. Based on the press reports, we should all be concerned by the buildup of China's nuclear forces in the western part of China. And then many members have asked me about these press reports of these novel delivery systems, these hypersonic systems. What I think has to bother all of us is the attitude of the Chinese government. They don't believe that they should be constrained in any way, shape, or form by arms control. The United States submits to that. Russia submits to that, at least did in the past. Our other nuclear allies, the United Kingdom and France, do. And so I think it's going to be very important. I know the Trump administration made an effort to do this and was right to do it, to push the Chinese to think about their obligations. And I think it's very important that we do that on a bipartisan basis. But certainly these are troubling developments. I said earlier, Senator, the Chinese have been saying for decades that they would like to have a minimum nuclear deterrence. And they seem to be quite rapidly moving away from that older policy of the Chinese government.
Thank you. Let me just continue down that line a little bit. It's more than simply nuclear development. There's also the issue of artificial intelligence. They will be a key player with regard to the deployment of artificial intelligence, not just in regard to national defense issues, but in all areas of technology. We've got before us the opportunity, and I think the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence made major requests to Congress to fund artificial intelligence activity and opportunities. Not real expensive, but clearly something that it's not just the United States, but China is working on. Could you talk about the need for the United States to continue to take a very active role in the most technologically advanced fields, including artificial intelligence, in order to maintain our leadership role, not just with regard to defense, but with regard to trade as well?
Thank you, Senator. 2 years ago, I organized a meeting of the bipartisan Aspen Strategy Group. I'm the director of the group, and we focused over 3 days on this issue. And we had some of the best experts from the U.S. government and the private sector, the tech companies, come and talk to us. And they identified the same concern that you have, that China will be competing us for commercial superiority in AI and machine learning, and this is their stated 2025 policy, in quantum sciences and biotechnology. They're obviously going to try to militarize those technologies, and the United States cannot let ourselves be in an inferior position and have the Chinese leapfrog over us on these technologies 5 or 10 or 30 years from now. So I think I agree wholeheartedly with you. We need to make strategic investments, and the Senate is doing that. And we need to continue to do that in this strength of the American economy, innovation, high tech, biotech, because it's likely to be the central arena of competition between us with China. And if I'm confirmed, it will be a central focus. It already is of the Biden administration, but I'll be very focused on it.
Thank you, sir, and I look forward to supporting your nomination. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for a service over a long career. I wanted to start with recognizing you've noted that China is not an Olympian power. And that just catches my attention because the Olympics in China are just 4 months away in February. And as we discussed in my office, I'm very concerned about the fact that the International Olympic Committee has placed the Olympics in a nation that is conducting genocide against its own people. And my preference would certainly have been for the Olympic Committee to say China had failed to follow its 2015 promises on human rights and that the Olympics were to be moved. That's not going to happen. The IOC has made that very clear. However, there are things that can be done to keep China from using the Olympics to gloss over its horrific human rights activities. For example, a diplomatic boycott. Another example would be fiercely defending the right of athletes to express themselves on what's going on in China while they're in China performing. What do you think what would you recommend to essentially try not to have China be able to use the Olympics as a way to create a cheerful facade over their horrific activities against minorities in their own country?
Senator, thank you. And I use the term Olympian not to refer, as you know, to the Olympics, but just to suggest that if you think about ancient Greece, China's not all-powerful.
No, understood.
On the question of the Olympic Games, the Winter Games, to be held in Beijing, it looks like it's going to be the most unusual games ever. It looks like if you look at the rules and regulations that the Chinese authorities have worked out with the International Olympic Committee, there'll be really nobody there from around the world because the precautionary measures that people are being asked to take, and obviously given a pandemic, will make it almost impossible for spectators from Japan or the United States to be there. So I think you'll largely have a Chinese audience. I think you're right, and I enjoyed our conversation about this 3 days ago. We obviously want to make sure that the American athletes, if they're there, and other athletes are able to speak their minds, are able to have access to the media to say what they wish to say because they come from democratic countries. And I hope and trust that the International Olympic Committee will make that possible.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I think fierce advocacy will be very valuable and in coordination with other nations. The Olympic Committee members say it's all about the athletes. So we don't really want to bring up, quote, political issues like human rights. But what they've done is force the athletes to become unwilling or unwitting participants in this effort to put a very bright and happy face on China at the same time there are such tragic and horrific practices. One of the biggest factors is the treatment of the Uyghurs and essentially engaging millions in slavery, many high-tech practices, forced sterilization, forced birth control, forced labor, that is slave labor, and in Hong Kong, where they've stripped the political rights. The Congressional Executive Commission on China held a hearing in which we heard advocate after advocate say this is a moment for the United States to grant P2 status to those who are particularly vulnerable in these two situations, both in Hong Kong and, if you will, among Xinjiang province, the Uyghur community. This is status given to groups of special humanitarian concern. Individuals still have to establish their personal vulnerability within that group. It allows them to apply from inside or outside the country and that it's the right fit. Is P2 status for those who are vulnerable in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang province something that you would support?
Senator, thank you. What I'd like to do is check with the State Department because I'm unsure of the answer to your question, and come back to you with an answer. Perhaps we can do that in written form, or we can meet and talk about it. I do know that President Biden has allowed Hong Kong residents to stay in the United States on a lengthier basis than they normally would because of the fear of persecution should they go back, given what's happened in Hong Kong. But I'm just not aware of what other measures the administration has taken or is planning, but I'm happy to take that question for the record.
Yeah, that status, deferred enforced departure, has been granted to those from Hong Kong who are already in the country.
Right.
It's an 18-month provision. It has not been granted to Uyghurs. We've had testimony from Uyghurs who have been here for 4 years because of their high vulnerability in return and have lost, and their families have lost any formal status in our country. They're awaiting action. I'll just close with a comment. If the chair feels there's time to respond, fine, but I'm over time, which is that I would really love to see champions in our diplomatic team push for an official determination of genocide in Myanmar because the actions against the Rohingya fully justify it, just horrific activities. The hesitation among some in the State Department has been to be critical because there is a fledgling democracy, except there's no longer a fledgling democracy because the military conducted a military coup and put Aung San Suu Kyi under arrest. When we fail to call out genocide in Myanmar, it undermines the legitimacy of the strength of our position on genocide elsewhere, including in Xinjiang province. So I'm encouraging consistency in calling out such horrific human practices when they occur.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Burns, welcome. I have long believed China poses the single greatest geopolitical threat to the United States for the next century. There are many domains on which we are standing up to China. One of the most important concerns Taiwan. And I worry that the threat to our Taiwanese allies is becoming acute. This week, the Chinese filled commercial ships with dozens of military tanks and practiced their amphibious landing capabilities in preparation for, quote, future battlefields. Earlier in the month, 149 Chinese aircraft made incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone over the span of just 4 days. U.S. commanders have publicly assessed that an invasion of Taiwan is, quote, much closer to us than most think. Meanwhile, Taiwan has been asking the United States to expedite the delivery of several squadrons of F-16s ordered in 2019. I strongly believe we have to do more to get them what they need to defend themselves. And I want to ask you a couple of questions about that. Number one, how do you see the Chinese threat to Taiwan, and what should we be doing to deter that threat?
Senator, thank you. It's a growing Chinese threat to Taiwan, attempts to bully and intimidate and to send these 149 aircraft into the air defense identification zone of Taiwan. And you combine that with the statements of the Chinese leadership, which are very aggressive and clear. We obviously have a self-interest, and under the Taiwan Relations Act, an obligation and commitment to help deepen our involvement in helping Taiwan to defend itself. And Congress and the executive branch, and we talked about this when we met in your office, have that authority and have that responsibility on the F-16 issue. The Biden administration has come forward with advanced howitzer sale of $750 million. I think a lot of experts believe that Taiwan needs a greater asymmetric defense capacity, needs to spend money in that to repel, as you say, the threat of an amphibious invasion or an airborne invasion, whatever the Chinese are thinking of. And I think that in the Taiwan Relations Act, it talks about the United States needing to make clear that its deterrent is in place, the power of our military in the Indo-Pacific, and our allies, of course, have to be part of this. So I think everyone here who's talked about Taiwan, and myself included, ought to be more concerned because the Chinese clearly are on a different path than they were 30 or 20 years ago.
I think one of the most important steps we can and should take to stand with Taiwan is help prepare and equip them to defend themselves and to defend themselves effectively against a serious military incursion from China. I'm intending to introduce legislation, the Taiwan Arms Act, that raises Taiwan's status for arms sales to that of our closest allies and partners. It is important, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee and other committees to see that it expeditiously becomes law. Let me turn to another aspect. One part of the solution to ensuring that our Taiwanese allies have what they need to defend themselves involve arms sales, such as the legislation I'm introducing, the Taiwan Arms Act. Another component of it, however, derives from our current policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan and towards Taiwan's status. And I'm concerned that that longstanding policy, and it's a policy that has existed across Democrat and Republican administrations, I'm concerned that it is undermining our efforts to bolster Taiwan. I have long advocated there is great virtue to clarity in foreign policy. The State Department is notorious for embracing lack of clarity, and strategic ambiguity seems to be one of the favorite tools of Foggy Bottom. In the context of China and Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party, I believe, interprets ambiguity as weakness and as a signal that we are not committed to Taiwan's security. How do you assess our current efforts to deter China, and what do you think the role that strategic ambiguity has in those current efforts?
Thank you, Senator. My own view, and this is also the view, of course, and more importantly of the Biden administration, is that the smartest and effective way for us to help deter aggressive actions by China, across the Taiwan Strait will be to stay with the policy that's been in place. And that's the Taiwan Relations Act, the three joint statements of 1972, 79, and 82, and President Reagan's 6 assurances of 1982. They're time-tested. They allow, under the Taiwan Relations Act, the executive and Congress to do more if you choose to do more, if both branches choose to do more to help Taiwan defend itself. Clearly, there's a different situation. You're right about that. But this is a policy that can succeed if we execute it consistently and with some strength. And as I said before, and I don't mean to repeat myself, but I think maybe the most important thing we can do is maintain the American military position in Japan, in the Republic of Korea, and that first island chain, but also out to our Anderson Air Force Base in Guam, and to be an effective deterrent to keep the peace. That's also part of the Taiwan Relations Act, that the United States has a role, Japan has a role. And I think under the banner of or the umbrella of a one China policy, where we recognize the People's Republic as the sole legal government of China, that's been the policy since 1979, we also have this unofficial relationship with Taiwan, and we can exercise responsibilities within that context. And I think that's the smartest way to deter the Chinese from trying to exercise force as opposed to keeping the peace and having a more respectful, long-term conversation with Taiwan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, for your answers to the questions that have been posed. The record for this particular part of the hearing will remain open until the close of business on Thursday, October 21st. Please ensure that questions for the record are submitted no later than Thursday. I would urge you, Ambassador, that upon receipt of questions for the record, that you answer them as expeditiously and as fully as possible so that we can schedule your nomination for a business meeting. And with that, and the thanks of the committee, you're excused at this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have 2 nominations on the next panel, and we'll ask those nominees to come forward.